All right, we are going to be discussing planes of movement, and this corresponds to the top of page 21 in your trail guide. So we discuss planes of the body, and then we discuss the movements that occur along those planes. We are going to be talking a lot about the movements that occur in the body, and then, of course, the muscles that produce those movements. So let's get to page 21. There we are. Planes of movement. So this is all that your book has. It's just this little diagram. I also have a Penguin Prof video on planes and directions, and I have a visible body ebook on planes and directions. So there's plenty more to view. All right, so let's start with the three planes within your body. We have the sagittal plane, the frontal or coronal plane, and the transverse plane. The sagittal plane divides the body this way, right? Divides the body into right and left halves. Now, a sagittal plane can be anywhere along the body as long as it divides it into right and left halves. Specifically, if we wanted to divide the body right down the center, it would be called a mid-sagittal plane. Mid-sagittal, dividing the body into equal right and left halves. Now, the reason that this is called the sagittal plane is because right at the top of the skull here, right where your part would be, is a suture. And a suture is just a really squiggly line that holds the bone together. And that particular suture that runs across the top of your skull here is called the sagittal suture. So this plane lines up with that suture. So it is the sagittal plane. Now the movements that occur along the sagittal plane, it says right here, are flexion and extension. Flexion and extension. I'm going to highlight those for you. Flexion and extension, because you do need to know this. So the best way to visualize how this works is to imagine that you have a board going all the way through the midline here, okay? If the board is going through the midline, you can't move side to side because the board would stop you, right? But you can go along the board, so you can go into flexion and extension, or front and back movements along the board, but you can't go side to side and you can't turn your head at all. Just flexion and extension, okay? So the movements are along the plane, not against it, okay? All right, so flexion and extension can be performed along the sagittal plane. The frontal plane is a plane that divides the body into front and back portions. And again, it can be anywhere along the body, here or here or here, but it divides the body into front and back portions. It is called the frontal plane, but it is also called the coronal plane. And corona comes from the Latin meaning crown. So this plane lines up with another suture of ours called the coronal suture, and that suture actually goes right across the top of the skull like this. Coronal crown, so you can imagine a crown would be sitting right here, right? Coronal plane or frontal plane, interchangeable, doesn't really matter. This plane, of course, as I mentioned, divides the body into front and back portions. And again, if we visualize a board going through us, kind of like this illustration here, we can imagine movements that would have to go side to side because we wouldn't be able to go front and back on this plane because it's holding us right there, okay? So these movements of side to side or up, hold on, trying to get to, there we go, that's what I want. These movements are going to be adduction and abduction. Oh, I'm not very good at underlining. As well as lateral flexion. There we go. As well as lateral flexion. Okay. So along this plane, if you're sitting, you know, you're watching here, I can do this with my neck, and I can do this with my neck. That's lateral flexion. Going, and my neck hurts on this side right now, so this is actually a little hard. Lateral flexion, okay? But I can also do abduction and adduction along this plane. And abduction and adduction occur at the shoulders and at the hips. So abduction is bringing the arm away from the body, and adduction is bringing it back towards the body. Okay, so kind of like you're flying. You're trying to fly, okay? Abduction and adduction, lateral flexion. Okay, so movements that occur on that plane. All right, now last but certainly not least, we have the transverse plane. The transverse plane goes across and through the body, or transverse to the body, and this divides the body into upper and lower parts. Just like the other planes, it can be anywhere along the body, so you can have a transverse plane here, separating the head from the rest of the body, or you can have a transverse plane at the waist, or at the chest, or it doesn't really matter, okay? It just divides the body into upper and lower parts. So imagine a piece of cardboard or a plate stuck straight through the middle of you. The only movement that can happen along this plane is rotation, okay? Think about it this way. I always like to visualize around Halloween time, you see, you know, the old head on a plate trick, where someone's hiding underneath the table and there's a hole in the table and their head's on, you know, sitting on a plate, and you scare your friends and family, and oh, wasn't it fun? Well, if you think about a plate right here, you can't do this, right? You can't do flexion. You can't go back or extension. You can't really go side to side because this is holding you in place. But what you can do is this. You can rotate from side to side. So rotation occurs within the transverse plane. All right? So frontal or coronal plane divides the body into front and back portions. The sagittal plane divides the body into right and left sides. And the transverse plane divides the body into upper and lower portions. And that's it. I will see you soon.